It would be nice to think that it might be a technique or a teaching, but just looking at the history of the human race, I'll bet you it's some kind of technology/drug type thing that is just going to be plugged in to us and our consciousness and our aspirations, and it may already be here. It may be the internet. It may be nanotechnology. It may be biotechnology and cloning and quantum teleportation and virtual reality and all the rest of this. I mean, we are just at the brink of taking these various pieces of the God-magician puzzle and putting them together and figuring out, well, what can you do? What do you do if you can do anything? I mean, that's really the question at the end of history. Once you have overcome all limitation, what is the human agenda?
You are listening to the C-Realm podcast. I'm your host, KMO, and I'm speaking with Bruce Damer and Galen Brandt. And we're talking about the late Terence Mckenna and his ideas for the year 2012, which it just now happens to be. And for people like me who have been listening to Terence Mckenna for years and years, it's sort of surreal. Galen and Bruce, how does 2012 feel to you so far?
Well, my mother is looking at the transcendental object. She has Alzheimer's, and she is progressing into an advanced stage in which her reality is shifting, and she has her eyes fixed on something that I can see in my own moments of surrender into a kind of eternal now. So I'm on my knees looking at the light, trying to understand what the light is that she's seeing. I think the transcendental object appears to any of us when we allow ourselves to surrender to the point of dying into an altered and perhaps more deeply true reality when we're creating, when we're writing a song, when we're making love and dissolving into the other. The French said that the moment of orgasm was called le petit mort, the little death. And I think any of us can at any moment avail ourselves of a surrender into that moment of little death. And whether it's through the elevated states brought about by the use of spirit medicines or simply by witnessing beauty, stepping into the mind of another who is advancing into light, performing conscious acts of surrender into creative mysteries, there we are, staring at that transcendental object. And I've been doing all of those things in the last couple of days. So at the moment, that's how 2012 looks to me. More and more opening into the light.
And I guess returning to your original question of what is the state of the world, where are we now in the 2012, I think from a nerd's perspective, and I am a nerd, you might think of it as perhaps Terence was always talking about the perfectibility of matter and the perfectibility of mind. And he was a great believer in that. And in some sense, Terence is a great product of the Enlightenment. And so he saw this endless march of progress up until 1999, 2000 in his death. But in some sense, the operating system that he was studying, which was marching along pretty well, although there were cracks in it, after the early to mid 2000s started to thrash. And when an operating system starts to thrash, you all this unpredictable behavior and disk I/O and wait states and trauma. And I think that Terence was sort of in the era before this, and us nerds put the hedge fund trading system and program trading into place. Nerds put automated inventories and currency exchanges into rapid fire programmatic trading. And so what happens is, and we nerds know this, is that when you wire things with high energy and low latency, and then you put people in there who are pushing and shoving on the system, you're going to get some really bizarre behavior. You're going to thrash the operating system. And so, the 2008 financial crisis, was a whole bunch of people gaming the system, from the average Joe who's refinanced his house 4 times to put his kids in college, and he's been convinced of that by the local banker who has relaxed rules so they can go and do this kind of thing, all the way up to people selling the derivatives, 3, 4, 5 times on the market to the regulators who aren't looking or don't understand because the thing is so complex. And we all built this massive house of cards that then failed. And when it failed so dramatically because of what nerds built. They built into the system the power of it to, when it tips over, no one can control it. So this goes back to Terence's idea of there are no cabals running the world. There are no viable conspiracy theories at this level. No, the horrible truth is no one is in control. And I think that we're looking at the operating system thrashing and thrashing and thrashing. And I've spoken in the past about something I've called the great crescendo, that the period that we're in isn't this perfectible singularity. It's this period of incredible extremes, of incredible brilliance. The launching of the Kepler telescope to look for planets, for Earth-like planets, an incredible thrashing in the system, incredible dynamism. Variously, no one has secure employment in the world of the future. But out of this crescendo, out of this period where you have all voices and all instruments, positive and negative, we're going to come through this it's going to transform us, but it's not going to be on a single date in a single year. It's just going to be a massive process of the thrashing of the OS and then finally the smoothing out of the process and the installing of new software, if you will.
I also think that people have been in a great state of denial, unconscious or willed. I think ever since, for decades now, but I think 9/11 thrust America in particular into a great state of traumatized denial, which spread to the world. And my sense is that now there's an opening. People are surfacing to consciousness and beginning to realize the truth of their situation and the planetary situation on many fronts, ecological, economic, spiritual. And with any kind of dawning realization comes anguish and terror and despair, and also the promise of real hope and movement forward, because you cannot move forward until you realize where you are. And I sense that in the same way that a child in the closet who hears its parents screaming and then asks the parents what's wrong and is told, oh, nothing, that child knows that that's not true, that something is terribly wrong, but is afraid to come out of the closet because the child wonders, who will catch me if I step into my own truth? Who will help me? My sense is that people are basically good, and that given the opportunity, will catch and hold one another.
And in the positive light, I mean, much of what is the pall over people's psyche and psychology is coming out of, the screaming media. If you turn off CNN and you don't look at all the reactionary websites and blogs and things on the left and the right in this country, and you just get on an airplane and you travel around the world, as I do a lot these days. I mean, I go from China to Pakistan to Peru, all over the world, and even in Pakistan you see incredible improvements in infrastructure, the airports. People have cell phones and now smartphones, so a cotton farmer in Pakistan, in Punjab, has access to information to get some products to market anywhere in the world. China is just an amazing transformation. I mean, that society has gone whole hog into consumerism. But on the other hand, the delight at which they're taking of building really good public infrastructure and the enthusiasm of people in China. Even Peru, which was 20 years ago in the thrall of guerrilla warfare, is a booming economy. All of Latin America is booming, and there's a lot of optimism. So everywhere you go, and I spent years and years in Prague, in the then Czechoslovakia, just after the Berlin Wall, and seeing the whole of Central and Eastern Europe be made over again. So the reality on the ground actually is much, much brighter and better than the reality on the airwaves.
I'm more attuned to emotional and spiritual infrastructure. I stay home a lot and write songs and write pieces and show them to people and talk to people. And from their response, it seems to me that people are expanding their understanding of what it means to die, what it means to be deeply human, what it means to be in this moment, what it means to respond from the heart and live in the heart. And that's where my hope comes from. I also see a great movement of people's back to not so much technological development as to a very primary relationship with the land on which they find themselves and the local community in which they find themselves, literally digging into the earth to find their roots as a family, to plant a garden, to become more aware of sustainable organic strategies for living and managing the planet, and more aware of how they can be useful and connected in their local communities, particularly in times of disaster and celebration, which is certainly where we're headed.
One thing that I do in talking to people and conducting interviews like this, I always have an ear attuned for possible episode titles. And I'm usually looking for some meaning-dense phrase that probably wouldn't mean a whole lot to somebody who was hearing it for the first time. And a phrase that caught my attention on this conversation is one that you use, Bruce. It is high energy and low latency.
Yeah, isn't that good?
Yeah, I'm wondering if you would expand on that. Say what that means, high energy and low latency, and what sort of dynamics it leads to.
Well, it's several years ago, our team was building models in software, in 3D software with physics, of Martian rovers for NASA. And I remember we attached our physics engine, which is a simulator of how the wheels act on the Martian soil, if you will. We plugged it in for the first time, and physics engines are great big feedback systems because the wheel's on the ground and it goes crunch, 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 but that means little contact points, which feed back to the engine, which tell the rover how it can move and how the motor can move. And as soon as we plugged in that engine, the rover just started doing a breakdance on one wheel. It was the funniest thing. In fact, we took a video of this to put online. And because we hadn't sufficiently dampened down the energy loops in the physics simulation. And so energy, and of course, in this sense, it's information. Terence talks about information flows are everything. They are what you were born with, what you will experience all your life, and what you will take to the yawning grave. Information is everything. We can't experience matter or energy directly. We're just information beings. So, but in the world economy and in the world system, the energy flows, i.e. the volume and the veracitude and the amplitude of information, is what is driving people. If people get a news report that there's an epidemic somewhere, even though it's on the other side of the planet, there's this pulse of energy of anxiety that moves through. Bad news travels fast kind of thing. Latency is the other side of this equation. If the time between when you get information and when you can act on it is very short, in fact too short, if you discover that there's an epidemic in China, and you discover it one day, but by the next day